It is good to be here, and I really appreciate you asking me to come and participate in your Wednesday night series this year. I feel the same way about Mike. I love him and Lana. A lot of respect for him, as well as his fellow peers, his preachers. Have a lot of respect for him and Lana. They're great workers, and I know you have respect for him. His teacher peers have respect for him, and so many students and other people in the community. And I know that you really appreciate him being here serving you. I'm not going to ask if everyone in the back can hear me, for one reason, is because there was a guest preacher preaching somewhere for the first time, and he asked that question. And someone in the back stood up, raised their hand, and he said, "I can't hear you." And about the same time, a lady sitting up the front stood up, turned around, pointed a finger. "I can hear him fine, and I'll trade places with you." I'm not going to ask that question tonight, and hopefully all of you can hear me this evening. How many of you have ever played baseball or football in a pasture? Anybody? Now, in the diagram, you have a cow on a soccer field. And you see what's on the field? Some poo. Cow pads. If you ever play football or baseball in a pasture, one of the things that you're very concerned about is when you start to slide or you start to dive for a ball, what's the first thing on your mind? Where's the poo? Where is the cow pads? Because we sure don't want to slide into them or fall face first in them. I'd like to read you The Call of the Barnyard. It was written in the 19th century by a Danish theologian and philosopher. A flock of wild ducks were flying in formation, heading south for the winter. They formed a beautiful V in the sky and were admired by everyone who saw them from below. One day, Wally, when one of the wild ducks in the formation spotted something on the ground that caught his eye. It was a barnyard with a flock of tame ducks who lived on the farm. They were waddling around on the ground, quacking merrily and eating corn that was thrown on the ground for them every day. Wally liked what he saw. It sure would be nice to have some of that corn, he thought to himself. And all this flying is very tiresome. I'd like just to waddle around for a while. So after thinking it over for a while, Wally left the formation of wild ducks, made a sharp dive to the left, and headed for the barnyard. He landed among the tame ducks and began to waddle around and quack merrily. He also started eating corn. The formation of wild ducks continued their journey south, but Wally didn't care. "I'll rejoin them when they come back north in a few months," he said to himself. Several months went by, and sure enough, Wally looked up, spotted a flock of wild ducks in formation, heading north. They looked beautiful up there. And Wally was tired of the barnyard. It was muddy everywhere. He waddled. Nothing but duck poo. "It's time to leave," said Wally. So Wally flapped his wings fiercely and tried to get airborne. But he'd gained some weight from all his corn eating, and he hadn't exercised his wings much either. He finally got off the ground, but he was flying too low and slammed into the side of the barn. He fell to the ground with a thud and said to himself, "Oh well, I'll just wait until they fly south in a few months. Then I'll rejoin them and become a wild duck again." I'm a little ahead of myself on the PowerPoint. But when the flock flew overhead once more, Wally again tried to lift himself out of the barnyard. He simply didn't have the strength. Every winter and every spring, he saw his wild duck friends flying overhead, and they would call out to him. But his attempts to leave were all in vain. Eventually, Wally no longer paid any attention to the wild ducks flying overhead. He hardly even noticed them. He had, after all, become a barnyard duck. What lessons can we learn from that particular story? Well, first of all, what appears to be attractive and wonderful and beautiful and pleasurable many times is not what it seems to be. You see, beyond the quacking, beyond the waddling, beyond the corn, there was the mud and there was the poo. He got tired of it. Well, he couldn't stand it any longer. Sometimes we become so complacent in life that we begin to accept our circumstances, the way that we live. We get used to the mud. We get used to the poo, and we do nothing about it. Why? Because it becomes a way of life for us. You know, in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, it says, bad company corrupts good morals, corrupts good character. 1 Thessalonians 5:22 tells us that we are to abstain, that we are to avoid even the very appearance of evil. I know as a teenager, so many times, teenagers feel like that they're missing out on all of the fun when they're raised in a Christian family, in a Christian home, because mom and dad do not allow them to do what some of their friends are doing. For example, maybe there's a bunch of their friends meeting Friday night uptown, but mom and dad don't let them go. And you know he's going to miss out on a great time. And the following afternoon, you go with your mother to the grocery store and you meet one of your friends, and he says, boy, you missed it last night. It was so great and wonderful. We did this and we did that. And a lot of times they begin to resent their mother and father. They begin to resent Christianity and resent God. Then hopefully they grow up and they realize there were many things that they were missing out on, such as underage drinking, fooling around with the wrong crowd, getting to petty crime, street fights, drunken behavior, gun fights, under the influence of drugs, loose sexual behavior. Then they come to realize what their parents were doing were trying to keep them out of the mud and out of the poo. You may be wondering what this has to do with Lot. Well, it has everything to do with Lot, as we're going to see in our lesson today. When Lot made that selfish decision to go down into the plain of Jordan, the plains there, go down to Sodom and Gomorrah, he started spiraling down in his spiritual life. And there's three questions I want us to examine this evening. Number one, what was the basis of that decision? Number two, what was the process involved? And number three, what were the results of his decision? So what was the basis of Lot's decision? Well, in Genesis chapter 13, verse 10, listen very carefully. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Even, notice what he compares it to, this plain of Jordan. Even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Did you see? Did you see the basis of his decision? He lifted up his eyes and he beheld. He saw this beautiful land that was just right for his cattle. A beautiful land that was rich to move into, and it would be very great for him to prosper even more. Now, why are commercials that we see on TV and on billboards and magazines made the way that they are made. It's so that we will see them, that we will behold them, that we will desire them, that we will want to eat them. The first time I saw this smokehouse brisket sandwich by Arby's, it looked so good. Amen. And I went, one day I was in Murfreesboro with my son and my grandson and son-in-law. We stopped at Arby's, and guess what I got? And it was delicious. And I've had it one time since then. No, I've had it twice since then. But they haven't been as good as that first one I had. But now you look at it. It looks scrumptious, delicious to me. Lot had already tasted the good life with Abraham. Prospered greatly. Both did. His problem is he wasn't satisfied. He wanted more in his life. The Jordan Valley, like the lush pasture lands of Egypt, also compared to that of the garden of the Lord, it was pleasure to the eyes. Secondly, man is influenced by what he hears. Now the text doesn't say this, but it's just like, back then, just like it is today. You have someone living somewhere, someone that's been to Las Vegas, someone that lives in Las Vegas, someone's been in New Orleans or to Finland or to Moscow, Russia, some of these top cities that are full of sin. They come back and they tell you how wonderful it is. They come back and tell you, look what you're missing out on. What they don't tell you is about the mud and the poo. They just tell you how great a time that they have had. And back during that time, you had people traveling from Sodom and Gomorrah, going to other places. You had people in the area going down to Sodom and Gomorrah and coming back. And I imagine that, I just know, without a doubt, that their paths crossed. And Lot found out about these plains of Jordan. And he wanted to go on down there and live there. Sin City. But now what do we do? When we make our decisions, we begin to rationalize and we begin to offer up excuses as a result of the decisions that we make. I do. I have. And I would say just about everybody tries to rationalize why they've committed a sin, why they've done what they have done. Could Lot have done that? Absolutely. Perhaps Lot thought, Uncle Abe has more than I have anyway. This will just balance everything out. Old Uncle Abe is kind of naive. He doesn't really care. After all, he gave me my choice. That wicked city really needs a strong witness for the Lord. This is us. After all, who's going to tell them about God? Then we get down there, do we really tell them about God? Whatever his realizations were, whatever his excuses were that he made, Lot's decision to go there was based upon selfishness. It was based upon his selfish desire. It was based upon his lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life. He was more interested in gold than he was in his God. He was more interested in cattle than he was his children. He was more interested in fortune than he was his wife. One day, a teenager who was raised not to forsake the assembly was asked by another teenager who was raised the same way. Went up to this other one and asked, let's go to a movie tonight. It was a Sunday afternoon. And let's go to a movie tonight instead of going to services. Let's skip church. No, better not, he said. Oh, come on, let's go. So they decided to go their separate ways. The one went to church, the other one went to the theater. The one that went to church that evening became a successful gospel preacher. The one that went to the theater became a Hollywood producer. One day that preacher was in Los Angeles having a meeting there, and he called his friend up, the producer, and asked him if they could meet together one day. And they did. They agreed to. And his friend asked him, you know, several years ago when I asked you to go to the movies, he said, yes, I remember. His friend said, little did I know that on that night we were prophetically choosing our life's work. You think about that for a minute. A little decision. It doesn't matter how small a decision is that we make. It can have a great effect upon our lives, and you never know where that road will take you if you go that direction. Lot has chosen a direction to go, and that is the way that he follows. Let's look at the process of Lot's decision. Let's look at verses 10 through 12. We read 10. Let's look at verse 11 and 12. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves, the one from the other. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. One of the very first things, as we noticed in a previous point, is that he saw. He lifted up his eyes and saw. He saw what attracted him. And how many times have we decided to go somewhere and do something because we've seen it with our eyes? Why did I go order that sandwich, that smokehouse brisket? Because I saw it with my eyes and it was pleasurable to my eyes. I love smoked meat. And I knew that sandwich would be really good. Did the same thing happen to Eve in Genesis chapter 3? Absolutely. One of the most talked about sins of Israel also began with the eyes. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2, David saw a very beautiful woman from his rooftop. He liked what he saw, so he inquired about her, and eventually this led to adultery, and it led to the murder of her husband. Not only did David suffer the consequences for the rest of his life, but his family suffered the consequences also. You see, most sins begin with the eyes. What we see, what we think is pleasurable, is full sometimes of mud and poo. He chose is the second thing that was involved in this process. In chapter 13, verse 12, he says that he chose for himself the valley of Jordan. Very few sins are ever committed without first choosing to do so. You think about that. We like what we see, then we purpose in our hearts, we choose in our hearts to do something about what we enjoy seeing or enjoy doing. A great illustration of one choosing to serve the Lord was Daniel. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says, he made up his mind. He purposed in his heart. You know what that means? He chose. Was he tempted to partake of the king's morsels? And sure he was. I don't think you could have found any better food in Babylon at this time to eat from the king's table. But yet he made up his mind. He chose not to defile himself with those things. Lot chose to indulge in the lust of the flesh. The third thing in the process of this decision is that he acted. He saw, he chose, then he did something about it. He followed through with what he chose to do. In verse 11 and verse 12, it says, and Lot journeyed east. They separated themselves, the one from the other, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent toward Sodom. So, first, man looks. Secondly, he makes a choice. Thirdly, he acts on that choice. He will go after whatever he sets his mind on, or he will flee from it. And you see, the decision is ours to make. It's no one else's to make for us. In Genesis chapter 39, verses 10 through 12, Joseph left his garment in the hands of Potiphar's wife and fled. He got himself out. Because he knew if he had followed through with what she wanted, it would have been a sin against God, a sin against Potiphar, and a sin against her, and a sin against himself. Now look at this. He lifted up his eyes toward Sodom. He pitched his tent toward Sodom. And he's sitting in the gate. He's living there. How many times have we taught our children this song? But do we apply it to our lives today? Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little ears, what you hear. Oh, be careful, little hands, what you do. Oh, be careful, little feet, where you go. Oh, be careful, little mouth, what you say. There's a Father above, and He's looking down in love, so be careful. And the song goes on. Now, I want you to focus on chapter 19, verse 1, just for a minute. It says that He sat there in the gate. Now, when we read that, we in King James Version, we really don't grasp what's taking place. What's happened? Society has accepted Lot into their midst. Lot has accepted them as brothers and sisters. Sitting in this gate, he had the responsibility of welcoming people to town. And not only welcome them to town, but he would inquire about their business. And he was even chosen with this type of responsibility to even settle small squabbles among the people there in the city. We see Lot being accepted by the inhabitants, being one of them. In fact, in Genesis 19, I believe it's verse 7, he refers to the wicked men of Sodom as brothers. That's to the extent that it went to. To Lot, the land looked attractive. Do you think that he was aware of the mud and the poo in the city before he went? See, the funny thing about it is the mud and poo's always been there. It was even there before he decided to go there. What do we do in our lives? We don't see the mud. We don't see the poo. What we see is the corn. We see the quacks. We see the waddling. We don't have to fly around and exert ourselves anymore. And so we overlook those things. And we set our minds upon what our eyes have seen that is pleasurable and follow through with it. Do you honestly think that Lot thought that he would become like the people in the city? You know what we say? It won't happen to me. That's what we say. Have you ever tried walking in a chicken coop without getting poo on your feet? It's almost an impossibility. It doesn't matter how careful you are. Sooner or later, you're going to get it on you. Was Lot going to be able to live like a wild duck while surrounded by tame ducks? And the answer is no. Well, what are the results of Lot's decisions? There's no doubt in my mind that God had Moses to write these circumstances about Lot so we can learn about the law of reaping what we sow. First of all, was the result of his decision was war. I'm going to begin reading in verse 8 and read portions of verses 8 through 11. It says, "And there went out the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there." In other words, they were killed. "And they that remained of Sodom and Gomorrah fled to the mountains." But notice verse 11, And they, the victors, the ones that defeated the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, has defeated the plains of Jordan there, took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, all of their victuals, and they went their way. So war was the first thing. The second thing is that Lot was kidnapped. In verse 12 it says they took Lot, Abram's brother's son who dwelt in Sodom. The third thing is that he lost all of his wealth, his material things in life. Notice verse 11 and 12. And they, the victors, took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals. Who would that have included? It would have included Lot and his family. Then in verse 12, it even specifically states, and they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Nothing left back home. War, kidnapped, lost his possessions back home. In verse 15 and 16 of Genesis 19, do you remember when God's ready to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and he's not ready to leave yet, and the angel has to take, the two angels take his hands, his wife's hands and his two daughters' hands. And the idea there is they literally have to bring them out of the city because they're not wanting to go. What does he have to leave behind? Again, whatever he's accrued during that period of time, since the war and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. What's the fourth result of his decision? He had great harassment and demands. There are so many times that we have people who claim to be our friends and we think that they're friends and they're really not friends at all. Friends are based upon mutual respect for one another, mutual love, mutual concern, and not selfishness. And sooner or later, when we make friends with wicked people, we're going to be disappointed. And we're going to be heartbroken. In chapter 19, verses 4 through 7, it says, before they lay down, talking about the two angels, the two men, the two visitors of the city that Lot had taken in. The men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. So they surrounded the house. They called into Lot. Notice his friends. Notice the ones that had him sitting up in the gate of the city, that's accepted him, that loves him. They say to Lot, where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us that we may know them. And Lot went out at the door to them and shut the door after him and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Now skip on down to verse 9. And they said, stand back. And they said again, this one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Notice, why bring that up? Because one of the responsibilities he had sitting in the gate was to judge small matters among the people. And now they're saying, now you're going to set yourself up to be a judge against us? Where's the friendship? Where's the respect of love towards one another? It's all gone here. So verse 9 is very important. And look what it does. He says, we will deal worse with thee. This is their friend, supposedly. We're going to deal worse with thee than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, upon Lot, and came near to break the door down to the point that the two men had to drag Lot back in. The fifth result is that he lost all his sense of right and wrong. His behavior becomes very bizarre. He protected the two men, but he offered his two daughters. In Genesis 19:8, he says, let them bring them out to you, his daughters, that you may do to them as you wish. For me, that's difficult to understand. He's being very hospitable to the two guests. But look what he's doing to his two daughters. You see moral deterioration in his life. From the very time he looked upon the plains of Jordan, he started spiraling down spiritually. Sixthly, Lot lost the influence on his family. Even those men that were married to his daughters had no respect for him. When he tried to warn them of the coming judgment, they did not take him seriously. In fact, in verse 14, it states that he seemed as one that was joking, that was laughing, that was mocking unto his sons-in-laws. They didn't believe in God. Why would they believe in the words that Lot is sharing with them? Number 7, lost his will to do what was right. Even in the context of a direct revelation from God, knowing what God was going to do, knowing what God's will was, Lot didn't leave immediately. He hesitated to leave. You read in verse 16 again, these angels had to take them and basically drag them out of the city. Number 8, Lot took advantage of God's grace. Even in the midst of God's compassion, His mercy, His love, His grace, Lot didn't want to obey Him completely. In verses 19 through 23, God told him to escape unto the mountains in order to be safe. But he imposed on God's grace and basically said, I don't want to go there. And so God allows him, look at the grace that he asked for. Okay, Lot, I'll let you go on down to the nearby to the city called Zoar. The 9th result is, running out of time, lost his wife. This is probably one of the most bitter results of Lot's decision, was the influence on his wife. Forcibly led out of the city. She looks back. She turns into a pillar of salt. Verse 26. Looking back here really had a lot more to do than just looking back. It had the desire to be back there, living in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God turned her into a pillar of salt. Then he committed sin with his 2 daughters. In verses 30 through 38. You hear men, evil men, wicked men, lacing drinks of women. What is so different in those cases than this case here, except it's turned around, the roles are reversed? Think about what's happening. Here's a widower, grieving over the loss of his wife, suffering the loss of his son-in-laws, suffering the loss of his belongings, suffering the loss of his home, suffering the loss of respect and honor. Now his 2 daughters act this way. 2 mature women. Their purpose is posterity. Their father's seed line was facing distinction. Remember, their husbands have been killed, and they set one goal for themselves, and that was to have children by their father, and they would go to any means for that seed line to continue. A question that we raise, was Lot saved? Was Lot saved? This ends the tragic story of Lot in the Old Testament. He's never mentioned again in the Old Testament. That's what amazes me. And at this point, many people will ask the question, was he a child of God? Don't think for a minute, Lot was a pathetic creature. An unconverted man, a child of this world. No wonder he got drunk and then got into a mess. No, sir, don't think that whatsoever. The Apostle Peter, answers that question for us in 2 Peter chapter 2. 3 times in those verses it says that Lot was righteous or just. You want me to give you a very basic, simple definition of what righteous means? You are right in the eyes of God. That's all it means. How do I know that? I'm studying the book of Romans right now. And that's what the book of Romans is all about. Being right with God. Being justified by faith. As a result of the grace that God has for us. How did Lot experience all of these tragedies in his life? First of all, tempted by what he saw. Secondly, making a choice. And then thirdly, acting upon it. Lot had every opportunity to go after what he had seen or to flee. Just like Joseph did. Some of the most important choices that we will make in our lives that will have such a great impact upon our lives and others. First of all, is the choice to follow Jesus. Whether or not we choose that. Who we choose as our mate. What we choose as a career. Who we choose as our friends. And choosing where to live. What part of the area, community, city do we live? Or the world? In Psalm chapter 1, verse 1, he said, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful." Joshua 24:15 tells us that we have to make a choice. And he made that choice to serve God, him and his family. The choice that we make tonight will determine whether or not you will walk around in the mud and the poo in your life. If you're not a child of God, that's exactly where you are headed. The mud and the poo. Do you want to be clean? Do you be washed away from all of that mud and poo, sin in your life? It's possible through Jesus. John recorded for us in Revelation 1 that Jesus, through his blood, looses us, frees us from all of our sins. Is that what you want? As we see